In today's Farm Report, as 2015 winds down, the expected 2015 farm income is becoming more certain for analysts. Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
There are some positive things and some negative things in the Department of Agriculture's latest forecast for net farm income this year. Now, back in February, USDA analysts were forecasting net farm income would be
$73.6 billion.
And by August, they had to take that down to
$58.3 billion.
And then the latest forecast
down to about $56 billion.
That's USDA Chief Economist Rob Johansson. He says that's a drop of over 38% from last year. It's the biggest year-to-year drop in net farm income in 32 years, going back to 1983. Now, the percent drop is a little larger, partly because of a revision upward in 2014's net farm income number, so it makes this drop seem larger. Net cash income forecast this year, $93.6 billion, down almost 28% from 2014. The news is not all negative. There is one major commodity group which will have higher receipts this year. That's specialty crops, up 5%.
That's the one bright spot. All the other commodity sectors have fallen.
For crops, cotton and rice receipts are going to end up down 32%, corn down 27%, wheat down 25%, soybeans a drop of 24%. All livestock category receipts will be down as well. The big one, dairy, down 70%. Hogs dropping 53%, poultry 23%. But here is one other bright and unusual thing concerning cost of production.
Total costs are expected to decline from their peak levels in 2014 by 2% in 2015.
And that hasn't happened in 6 years. However, the lower commodity prices and farm income levels are bringing the level of debt for farmers up a little bit.
By about 6% relative to 2014.
Rob Johansson says the value of farm assets will have dropped by about 2% this year, taking farm equity levels down almost 5% from 2014, the first year-to-year drop since 2009.
So that leaves us with a debt-to-asset ratio of slightly under 13%. Now, if you recall, we were expecting to be slightly under 11% coming into this growing season. Either 11%, 12%, 13%, they're all very low historically.
Back in the 80s farm crisis, that ratio was up to 20% and more for many farmers.
So the farm balance sheet is still strong in that sense.
Also, farmers are expected to get about 10% higher government safety net payments in 2015 to about $10.8 billion. That will help, and that's not counting their government crop insurance subsidies. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Prospects for U.S. agricultural exports are certainly much dimmer now than just 3 months ago, with USDA dropping its fiscal 2016 forecast by $7 billion down to $131.5 billion. One of the key reasons:
diminishing demand in China.
Agriculture Department senior economist Sharon Saito says that diminishing demand has caused USDA to cut its forecast for China purchases by $2.3 billion. Part of that is the strong dollar, but Chinese policies have a lot to do with it. They're expected to cut back sharply on buying U.S. feed grains.
China has actually been supporting its corn sector quite a bit, and so that's really reduced demand for some of these other feed grains, sorghum and distillers' dried grains and solubles, as they try to find uses for their own domestic corn.
Also, China has stockpiled a lot of cotton, cutting U.S. sales to China and price prospects for cotton around the world. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The outbreak of World War II spurred industrial production, but it also spurred increased production in agriculture, and that was mainly due to the increased role of women on the home front. Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
Brother, can you spare a dime?
During the Depression years 1929 to 1941, the government had agricultural programs to keep farmers from producing too much and sending prices to those farmers plummeting down, as had happened during the Depression. But then came December 7th, 1941.
We have witnessed the severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
Suddenly, the country was at war, and not only did industrial production have to be revved up in a hurry, but also food production.
There was a need for food, not just to support our own army, but there'd been just years of devastation in Europe.
Agriculture Department historical expert Ann Efland says boosting farm production was a particularly difficult proposition, since many young men were being drafted into the military right off the farms. Others were going to work in defense plants, factories making planes, tanks, and other war materials.
She's making history, working for victory, Rosie.
Yeah, with men going to the Army, women, who up to that point mostly were homemakers, began filling many of those factory jobs. Meanwhile, farmers couldn't pay the kind of money the factories were paying, and finding labor to produce the needed food was a top priority of the country and of the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
It became apparent that the USDA might need to step in and coordinate recruitment of adequate labor. And the Emergency Farm Labor Program begins in 1943, and it's under the Extension Service.
And out of that came a plan to encourage non-farm women to come out to rural areas, work on farms. It was called the Women's Land Army.
And they did a lot of advertising along the lines of spending your vacation doing something important for the war effort. College girls, they would try to recruit for the entire summer or maybe during breaks. And then housewives who might otherwise go on a family vacation, sometimes for a week, sometimes for a month.
But Ann Eflin says many urban women who signed up were doing so on a per-day basis.
You would go to a meeting place and they would pick you up in trucks and take you to the work and then bring you home at night.
Records show over 2 million non-farm women participated in one way or another in the Women's Land Army.
And I would presume that there were many more who just did the work and didn't worry about having it counted. So it's millions and millions of women who are participating in producing food.
Plus, the women who lived on farms already stepped up to the war effort as well.
The amount of work that farm women themselves were doing on farms doubled between 1940 and 1942.
And President Franklin Roosevelt during the war acknowledged all of these efforts, saying that thanks to farmers, the Women's Land Army, thanks to victory gardens by millions of urban residents,
there is enough food today for all of us, and enough left over to send to those who are fighting with us.
And experts say food was one of the key factors in helping the Allies win World War II. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
I'm particularly pleased that Secretary Vilsack is with us, and I very much look forward to hearing what he has to say about the prospects of the agri-food sector.
I certainly appreciate the invitation that Commissioner Hogan extended to me. I certainly have appreciated the relationship and the friendship that we have developed.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack and European Union Ag Commissioner Phil Hogan spending Tuesday at the European Ag Outlook Conference in Brussels, Belgium, sharing their respective governments' perspectives on agriculture. Secretary Vilsack's visit reciprocated the EU Ag Commissioner's participation at last year's USDA Ag Outlook Forum plenary session, and the Secretary used his visit to introduce the American farmer to Europeans.
Because I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that there is a monolithic American agriculture, and that's certainly not the case. It is important for everyone to understand that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to agriculture within the U.S.
Adding there are many similarities between American and European ag producers. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.